is Desiree Kameka here. I am the Director of Community Engagement and the Housing Network for the Madison House Autism Foundation. Today we're going to talk about words. So one of the things that has come up during my presentations, Madison House, we like to use both person first language and identity first. So I might do a presentation and say, well, people with disabilities, this, and this, or the autistic adult, blah, 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 or this person with autism, blah, 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 blah. And I've had a lot of people come up to me after and tell me, Desiree, you really should be using person first language. And then I've had to have a conversation about them and send them some links about identity first language. And so I thought that it might just be helpful to talk about words. And so that's why I wrote that article about words. And it's not to say this is the list and this that you have to use or that you shouldn't use. That certainly wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose of it was really to just help give people a guide on, this is how you can talk about disability. And this is why some people like to use this word, and this is why other people like to use another word. My church is, I'm part of the UCC denomination, and we have this designation called Accessible to All, A to A. And basically, it's a designation where a church goes through not just making our church physically accessible, but also we have a workshop where our church members got together and got to talk about how to be more inclusive in attitude as well, which is super important, right? Even more important than just the physical barriers is attitudinal barriers. And so when we had sat down all together, everyone was like stumbling over their words because they really want to be more accessible, right? And more welcoming to people with disabilities, but they had never been taught how to talk about disability. And so we had to have that discussion about these are some of the different words you can use and maybe some of the words to stay away from. There's a lot of people who use wheelchairs in my church, and so the word wheelchair bound came up. And so then we had to talk about, well, what does that mean, right? This wheelchair is a tool for freedom and access. This person is not bound by their wheelchair. This wheelchair is this person's tool for accessibility. And so I think knowing meanings behind why people use certain words and don't use certain words is super helpful. So I guess let's just start with identity first and person first language. Person first language is saying a person with a disability, a person with mental illness, a person with autism, a person with Down syndrome. That's person first language. And the meaning behind that is that we see the person first and not their disability, right? And identity first language is when a minority within the disability community speaks about themselves as an autistic adult, or I am part of the deaf community. Identity first means that their diagnosis, neurodivergence or impairment is part of their core identity. So they can't just separate that. They don't want to separate that, and they don't want to separate it linguistically either, because they are proud to be an autistic adult. Oh, good note. This really is, I'm talking about words in the USA context. So I had a huge lesson once. I used to do work with the World Council of Churches, the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network, and they sent me to Jamaica. And I got to hang out with some amazing disability rights activists from all over the world. And I was used to using the word differently abled because I didn't want to label people as having a disability. And I thought differently abled was the best way to be able to talk about someone, because then they're not so different, because we all have different abilities, right? And so I get to this conference and we're all sitting around, and the advocates start talking, and most of the people there were self-advocates. I was one of the only non-disabled people there, and the advocates start referring to themselves as the disabled. And I was so shocked because I was like, well, they have to know that that word is not appropriate, right? But that was me putting my USA based cultural understandings on them. And so then I asked one of the women who was from North America with me, I said, um, I've been using differently abled and they're using the disabled and I just don't get it. And so she explained to me that in their country, that's how they identify. Um and so they use that language. And she said, for me, as a person with a disability, she had a disability. She said, I don't like to use differently abled because I have a disability and I need the accommodations that go with that very profound word. I have protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act because I have a disability and I have these supports and I'm not ashamed to be a person with a disability. And so that was a real news flash to me was, oh my gosh, I need to be thinking about, well, how do people with disabilities want to be referred to and why do they use certain language? And as an able-bodied or neurotypical person, we really should be reflecting the language that they choose. And so that was a really big learning opportunity for me. um, I went to many of you may know I have an autistic roommate, and we went to a person-centered planning activity. It was really neat. Our state actually hosted it so that we can get started, and they gave us the materials to start our person-centered plan. And the woman who was leading this started telling the people who were there that she doesn't use special needs, that word special needs, because that's a segregating word, right? And my roommate, I was so proud of him. My roommate stood up and was like, excuse me, but I use special needs and I have special needs. And so my roomie, Daniel, he does not identify with identity first language. He doesn't even use person first language. He always uses special needs. And he has found in his own experience, and I've explained to him, why people use different language, but he prefers to use special needs because when he goes somewhere, he likes to introduce himself. And he says, hi, my name is Daniel. And if he feels uncomfortable, he often discloses, he says, I have special needs. I have autism. And he just feels as if that gives people more understanding about who he is. He doesn't look like he has a disability, and so he can pass sometimes. But, by him disclosing, he's been able to actually get a lot of support from our local community. He goes down to the biker bar down the street, and everyone knows him. And if there's an uncomfortable situation, they know how he reacts and they say, hey, they pull him away from that uncomfortable situation. And it totally works. It's awesome. And I think that's what we're really looking for, right? Is that person first attitude, for people to see Daniel as their neighbor, as their person, that comes to the bar just like anyone else. And the words that we use, I think it's important that we reflect, the words of the self-advocates that are around us. But what we're really looking after is what Judy Endow, a self-advocate on the spectrum, talked about, is that person-first attitude, is making sure that, the words that we're using, we're coming from the right place. And so just to make sure that those words are not offensive to the people that we're talking about. And I think that, and by the way, anyone who is part of this discussion, please ask questions. I don't want this to be just Desiree talking. I'd really love to hear, from all of you that are on the live feed. If you have any questions, I'd love to be able to, just share them with you, share my perspective, and then maybe where you can find some more resources. But the other area about language that we have to be really aware of, and it's one, to be able to reflect language, right? Disability first, person first or identity first, but really it's about attitude. But it's also, words are important when we're talking about supports. And so I think, working for Madison House, I get people who contact me, and I'm the project lead for the Autism Housing Network. And one of the things that we do is we offer consultations. And so oftentimes I will have a family member of somebody with disabilities contact and say, hey, we're interested in starting a facility for our son. We're really concerned about what happens when they pass away. And at that point, it kind of makes me cringe, but I take that time to be able to talk to them about, well, I really don't think you want to create a facility per se. I think what you're talking about is you want to create a home. Um, and so the words that we use to talk about the supports that people with disabilities have, I think can really help with the greater community's understanding. So no, we don't, people with disabilities don't automatically live in facilities. They live in homes, just like you or I. And, people with disabilities say they go to a facility-based day program, right, or a sheltered workshop. Instead of using those words, we can say and we're talking about people who are in like the greater community who don't understand what those words means, to say, yeah, Johnny's going to his job today. Or, they're going to their doctor's appointment, or Maria's going to go to her day program today. They're going to go, watch a movie and whatever. I think using words that are more just words that everyone else understands and that everyone else would use to describe their own day is important, so that we start to show people that people with disabilities, yes, they need supports, and there might be certain programmatic aspects of their life, that it's important that other people outside of the disability world also know that that's part of their life. They go home, they go to work, they go to see their friends, and that's awesome. We need to create more opportunities, right? Because we know that there's not enough jobs, and there's not enough homes, and there's not enough places where people can build neurodiverse relationships. So we need to continue to do that. But I think our language can also help. The other kind of term that I got a little bit of pushback from was the low functioning and high functioning term. And really that goes back to how can we help people better support and be community to folks with disabilities. And so when I use the term, oh, my friend is low functioning, what does that mean for the person that I'm telling them? Are they thinking my friend, because he's non-vocal, doesn't understand? Or does that mean to them that they should only talk to me because they don't have anything to do with that person? I think it's a better use of our words to say, my friend may not be able to communicate with words, but they use a talker, or they understand what you're saying. Or even though we don't know if they understand, you should still look at them if you're talking about them and refer to them as if they're just another person being here. And that's just a way to be able to give people some heads up on what that person may or may not be saying. Also, it could be helpful if somebody has say they stem, right? Somebody may not understand what stemming is, and so they may, be looking at that person if they're rocking back and forth or shaking their hand kind of strange, and be like, oh, sometimes, she likes to stim when she's happy, or maybe sometimes she stims like this when she's feeling overwhelmed. So if you see her doing this, getting her to a quieter place might be really helpful for her. Or just being able to give someone a little bit more details about the way in which they can support someone, instead of just saying, oh, they're low functioning or they're high functioning. I think the high functioning thing is really not super helpful either. I have a lot of friends who are high functioning or ASPE, and they fall through the cracks all the time because people assume they can do, they don't need any support, and that's not true either. And so, for my friends who I have who are on the spectrum who are high functioning, if it would be more helpful for me to say, hey, this is my friend, and if something's happening, we're at a restaurant or something, and they start rocking back and forth, that might mean this. Or sometimes holding a spoon isn't weird. Don't make fun of their spoon. Their spoon is awesome. It helps them to be able to get through their day. So I think just making sure that we're talking about people's support needs instead of just, oh, this person's high functioning, oh, this person is low functioning, will give people a lot more confidence in how to support them, but also just talks about that person specifically, that individual. What are their individual needs? So yeah. Any questions? Concerns? Disagreements? You don't have to agree with everything I say. It's, I think we're all in just a learning process. So the more that I get feedback from others, the more helpful that it is for us to just continue the discussion. And I think that's really important. Okay. Well, if there aren't any questions, we like to get feedback from our different live streams. And so if you can send us, fill out the survey that is in the chat box, that would be very helpful so we can learn how to make things a little bit more helpful in the future. Oh, and then the other thing was, okay, that's right. For those of you who haven't read the article, going through a couple of the words that are acceptable or that aren't as confusing to people might be talking about, if you're talking to someone on the autism spectrum, if you don't want to use person first or identity first language, you can always say Alex is on the autism spectrum, right? I think when we talk about people with disabilities in their roles as self-advocates, meaning they're speaking for themselves and they're advocating for themselves or for other stuff, that's really important that we talk to them as a self-advocate because their voice is really important. What is consumer-controlled housing? Okay, so consumer-controlled housing and provider-controlled housing, these are really important terms, and they're very specific. In new regulations, in new HCBS regulations, there's different regulations regarding consumer-controlled and provider-controlled settings. And so a provider-controlled setting is like an adult foster care arrangement, a host family home arrangement like us, a group home, and this is where the provider of services either leases or owns the home and rents it back to the person that they're providing services to. So Daniel lives with me in my home. He pays rent, just like our other roommate. But if something happens to my mom and she needs to come and live with us, Daniel does not have the choice to stay. He has to leave. Or in a group home situation, say someone lives in a group home and they get a new roommate and their new roommate is driving them bonkers for whatever reason. That individual doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to move into their own home and bring their service provider with them. Or if their service provider is no longer meeting their needs, then they don't get to stay in their home. So provider controlled means that like the provider and the services and the home are connected, inextricably connected. Okay, so consumer controlled housing is like going and getting a house wherever you want in the community, and then you choose your provider. So if I go and rent an apartment somewhere, I get to choose what provider I would like to provide services to me. And then if I decide that I no longer like that provider or that supportive roommate, I can ask them to leave and change. And so the difference between consumer-controlled housing and provider-controlled housing is really important, especially when we're talking about caregivers, like live-in caregivers, host family homes, adult foster homes, those are provider controlled. The provider owns the home and invites a person with disabilities to live with them, but if they no longer can provide support, that person with a disability needs. Whereas in a shared living arrangement, the individual with the disability invites their supportive roommate or their host family to live with them, and then if that arrangement isn't working out, they can ask them to move. So there's a big difference between provider-controlled and consumer-controlled homes, right? And so as you're exploring different housing options, to just be aware of that is really important. On the Autism Housing Network, we have a virtual tour that kind of talks about the benefits and the considerations of many different housing and support models. And I think it's important that everyone is an individual, and so everyone's support needs are very different. And for some people, living in a provider-controlled setting works better. They don't have to worry about maintaining the home. They don't have to worry about recruiting and training staff, and they're okay with not having as much control over those type of decisions. For other people, a provider-owned and controlled situation just is not going to work. And so for them, making sure that they can access consumer-controlled housing that is affordable and being able to get their supports in that place is extremely important, because that might be their least restrictive environment, whereas for others, a provider-controlled environment might be better for them. So those are really two important words to understand, because those words are attached to federal regulations, which are attached to the regulations needed for people to access their waivers. So sometimes words really matter in terms of what type of services people can access and how those services are described. So to understand the difference between provider-controlled and consumer-controlled, I think is really important too. So thanks for the question, Madison House. Any other questions, concerns? Okay. Well, if you haven't already, please fill out the survey. There's a box in that survey. If there was a question that you just didn't want to ask for whatever reason, you can always ask it there and I'll get back to you as well. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us, and let us know what else you want to see in a live stream in the future. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day. Happy Halloween! Yay!